Join us tonight for a special intimate class. We start looking at the Parsha, the Torah portion, and from the Torah portion, we find something that we would like to talk about. So in this Torah portion in Beshalach, it was, wow, in my face, like no brainer. You know, you got a lot going on in the Torah portion. You have Exodus, leaving Egypt. You have the splitting of the sea. You have the song after the splitting of the sea. You got a lot of stuff. But right away, even before I opened it up, I'm like, I know exactly what I want to talk about. By the Shira, after the leaving of Egypt. The Egyptians pursued them and they're like, oh my gosh, let's give in, surrender, go back to Egypt. Let's suicide, let's fight, let's daven. And none of those was the right answer. The right answer was keep walking. God said to keep walking. So we just do what God says. And Nachshon ben Aminadav, according to some opinions, Nachshon ben Aminadav and his entire tribe of Yehuda, of Judah, they just walk into that water. And when the water hit Nachshon's nostrils, like this is it, the end, the water split and the Jews walk through. And the pursuing Egyptians say, oh, wow. And they just run right after and the waters crash on them. And that was the final destruction of that enormous evil called Egypt. And afterwards, they sang to God. The men sang, the women sang, praising God. And in the song of the men, there was a very beautiful line that our sages discussed. And they said, Zeh Keli va'anvehu. This is my God, and I will glorify him. I'll beautify him. This is my God. Now, okay, it's a nice line. It was a nice song of praise. What was the significance of saying, Zeh Keli, this is my God? The significance is that this means something you can point to. This, who was pointing? So the sages say the children were pointing. Which children? The ones born after the decree, where Pharaoh said, that's it. Any Jewish boy born, done, gone, drowned, killed, murdered, executed. No more Jewish boys. We don't want any more Jewish people, and we don't want any more Jewish boys. And what happened? How were there still Jewish children? Because there were Jewish women around. And the Jewish women knew how important it was to have children, which means knew how important it was to have relationships with their husbands. And therefore, these women would go out to the field with mirrors to entice their husbands to conceive children, trusting God to protect them, to protect those children. They were doing something really nuts. Their husbands are exhausted. Their husbands are slaves. They were also slaves. They were also tortured. They were also exhausted. And they said, we want to go out to the fields. We want to have relationships with our husband. We want to give our husband that gift, and we want to produce children. And we want to produce children, never mind for anyone having a child. Do we have the stamina for it? Can we afford it? Can the family unit handle it? Here, there was no stamina and no money and no family unit, and they were slaves. And every child, every male child was supposed to be murdered. But they still knew that we need to produce children and that God's going to somehow protect them. And God did. These children were fed, we're told, by the rocks, nurtured by the angels. And every one of these children left. And some of these children hadn't been with their family for years, but every one of these children left with the Jews, and they were the first to recognize God. Zekeli, that's my God. They knew him. They were raised by him. Now, if we fast forward a few months after the Exodus, it came the time for building the tabernacle. And the Jews were donating. They were running, racing to donate all their precious items to build the Mishkan, to build the tabernacle. And the women came. The women were actually told came before the men. The men were racing on the heels of the women because the women got there first. And one of the items the women wanted to donate were their mirrors. Now, a mirror is a piece of glass, but their mirrors were glass over copper. And so they wanted to donate their mirrors as part of the copper that would be donated to the tabernacle. And we're told that Moshe hesitated. Mirrors could be to enhance in a not very modest fashion. I mean, it's not forbidden, but is this appropriate for God's tabernacle? Should we really use these mirrors? And he wasn't sure. And God told him, take them. These are more precious to me than anything else donated. Through these mirrors, the troops of the Jews were produced in Egypt. We see the mirrors and what they led to. And that was so appreciated by God because it really reflected belief, trust, hope, self-sacrifice. I mean, could you imagine? Like, I really can't imagine doing it. I guess I did it because this generation is a reincarnation of the generation that lived in Egypt. So all of us women did it, but it really, because if I think about it realistically, you know, not like a story that I'm reading, but like if I think of it as reality, I'm so drained. I'm so exhausted. I've been working as a slave all day. And I know any child born that's male is going to be killed. And I go in the fields to coax my husband to get him interested, to deliberately get pregnant when Pharaoh's killing all the male babies. And I'm trusting so much that God will watch these children and it's going to get better. And there's a reason to bring children into the world, a good reason. There's going to be redemption. There's going to be a Jewish people, and we have to perpetuate those people. Wow. I can't believe I did it. I can't believe I was that amazing. I mean, again, assuming I was one of those women that did it, but who knows? Every one of us here, maybe every woman, Jewish woman today was one of those women that did it, that gave birth to children, who left Egypt, who experienced the splitting of the sea, who got the Torah, and who became God's people. That was the righteous woman, which actually, of course, as we're told, and of course, every woman knows this, that in our merit, in the merit of those righteous women, the women and their children and their husbands all got us in a previous lifetime. As I said, the Arizal, the second greatest Kabbalist of all times, explains that the generation of redemption is a reincarnation of the generation that left Egypt. We knew how to bring redemption. We did it before. We're doing it now again. And since these women were models in trust, in putting family first, in their belief in redemption, in all those areas, we have enormous strength. So that was us about 3,300 years ago. Now I'd like to fast forward to the 21st century. We are still challenged in this area. So that was us about 3,300 years ago. We fast forward to the 21st century and we're still challenged. Different challenges. There's no Egyptian mad dictator bent on our destruction, but there are challenges within and challenges without. I want to focus on 3 different challenges in this area that I'm aware of. I'm sure there are more and I welcome input, but I want to talk about challenges with mikvah. And because we're looking here at these women and what they did, which means what, as I said, we did in a previous lifetime, they really stood up for something that's hard for any woman in any situation. And I want to speak about the challenges I see people having today. The background is it's amazing how mikvah has been with the Jewish people throughout. Even in Mitzada, for those of you that were in Mitzada, I'm sure they showed you the mikvaos. The mikvaos in Mitzada, there was more than one. Amazing, amazing. In Mitzada, fighting the Romans, a fortress mountaintop. But what did they have to make sure they were? There has to be mikvah. There has to be more than one mikvah. We don't want any issue that any woman would have any difficulty in going to mikvah. So it's been with us throughout. I could speak about the Jews under the communists, the Jews in the Holocaust. Every point in our history, we have stories of women and their self-sacrifice for mikvah. But in our time, we are challenged. And I want to focus on 3 different challenges that I see. And I'm sure there are many more challenges, but these are the ones I'm aware of. And I wanted to address them. I don't have any simple solutions, because if there were simple solutions, you probably wouldn't need me to address them at all. So there's no simple solutions I'm offering, but I want to heighten our awareness. That's really my goal tonight, to heighten the awareness. No solutions, but awareness. So one challenge that I'm aware of is women who are upset with their husbands, don't want to be with them, and therefore they push off their mikvah night. They either don't tell their husband exactly the calendar, and they wait. They wait until they're ready to be with their husbands, and that's when they go to mikvah. Or some of them do tell their husbands that they're not ready to go, and therefore they're not going to mikvah. Now, obviously this is a very delicate area, because the law is you're not supposed to have relationships if you're upset with your spouse. You're definitely not allowed to have relationships if you're contemplating divorce. That's forbidden. And on the other hand, it's a very significant commandment. It's a foundation.
Aren't you not allowed to push that off at all?
So that's exactly my point. Yes, you are not allowed to push it off at all. You're not. So obviously, if what was being done was okay, I wouldn't be talking about it. It's not okay. And yet a woman feels, I don't want to be with my husband right now. So I can't go to mikvah and not be with my husband. So I'm just not going to go. And as I'm saying, the delicacy of the situation is, so I should go and not be with my husband? Well, that's not supposed to happen either. So I should go and be with my husband, not wanting to be with him, even if I would do that? Well, you're not supposed to do that either. So it's a very tough, hard situation. You're not supposed to have relationships if you're upset. You're not supposed to push off mikvah. It's the foundation of a Jewish home. As you said, we're supposed to have relationships specifically on mikvah night. That date with mikvah. So that's the backstory. What could I say about it? But I want to say what I was thinking of. And I really thought a lot about this because the issues I'm aware of, this is screaming at me from the Torah portion to talk about it. But what do you say besides being aware of the issues? So what I feel is the point of focus that I would be asking a woman to have if she actually spoke to me about this would be appreciate God's involvement in your marriage. Meaning here we have a woman who's a religious woman. I mean, she goes to mikvah. She's not going to have relationships with her husband without mikvah. And obviously there's something going on in her marriage that she doesn't want to be with her husband. And it's sort of like so what do I do? Go? I'm not supposed to have a relationship with him when I don't want to be with him. And I wouldn't have relationships anyway because I don't want to be with him. Officially not supposed to put off mikvah. But what else should I do? So it's a very hard situation. And what I felt really was the only way to get out of it, to get past it, was to appreciate God's involvement in your marriage. So I want to share a little incident that happened, and I've shared it before in the class, but it makes such an impression on me. So this was with a woman I was close to, not religious couple, and people that had come from the Soviet Union, settled in America, and this woman of the couple started going to my class. I met her husband a few times, a very lovely couple. He's a musician, and she works in physical therapy. And I had spoken at one time in the class about how important it is to get married according to God with a chuppah. And she was so excited, as women generally are. And she went home and her husband said, no way, as they generally do. Okay. And life continued. And then unfortunately, horrible tragedy. She became very ill. She developed a tumor in her brain. And at that point, we revisited the idea of her getting married with a chuppah, getting married according to God's will. At this point, her husband was going to go along with what she wanted, and they agreed. He agreed. She wanted it. They agreed. She had already had a major surgery. It was a hard time. And we did it. And I knew her husband was just going along with her. And of course, before mikvah, before getting married, you have to, have the whole preparation of counting the 7 days and going to mikvah and then getting married. Court with a chuppah, and I was physically, doing everything and whatever, made the wedding for them. And I saw at the wedding, after the chuppah, her husband came over to me and was very happy. And later that night, after the wedding was over, he again came to me, to my husband, and thanked us so, so, so much for making this wedding. And I was really surprised because I knew he was just going along with it for his wife's sake, going along with the show. From his end, they were married for many years, whatever. He wasn't religious at all. He didn't explain to me then what was going on. I think the first time he told me was after she had already passed away, which he did about a year or so later, about a year later. And he told me that when he came for his Jewish wedding that night, this was right after his wife was diagnosed, he was completely drained, spent. He was taking care of his wife. He was taking care of his 2 children. He was running the home, shopping, cooking, cleaning. It now became a 1-salary family because his wife couldn't work. So he felt like on every end done, strapped with money, strapped with all these very difficult medical decisions, taking care of a very sick woman, raising 2 girls. He was done. And he stood under that chuppah, feeling completely burdened. And my husband said all the blessings, and it wasn't like a chuppah where you call up the friends and relatives. My husband just went through all the blessings. And as my husband was saying the blessings, as they got married under their chuppah, this man who is completely not religious felt God. He felt God come into their marriage. And he realized that he can handle this because he's not alone. It's him and God and his wife. It's not the two of them, him and his wife. It's him and God and his wife. And with God as his partner, he can handle this. And that happens every marriage. Every time you're under the chuppah. Maybe we're sensitive or stressed enough to feel it. Maybe not. But God is truly a partner. God literally is within the marriage. And proper mikvah and hair covering are the ways to let his presence be felt, to let those blessings shine in the marriage, in the harmony, in the children. So when someone pushes off mikvah, this is so huge. And as was said, not allowed, because it's pushing God to be less effective in helping the marriage. So when a marriage isn't doing well, that is when we need God more in the marriage, not less. So what do? I don't have any simple solutions. The only thing I could say you need to do is a couple needs to prioritize working on what we refer to, of course, as shalom bayis, as harmony between the couple. Understanding this is godly work. This is what God wants from you. And when you work on it, he will help. I think also it's important to understand ourselves and our psyche. And for a woman, it's a very deep pain to be in an unhappy marriage. And so it's worth the work. It's worth the work to improve it. And a person could think, well, if an unhappy marriage is such a pain, just walk out. That's a simpler solution. We are not trained to work hard. We want to work not at all. So just leave. But I'm sure we all know that it's rarely an easy fix for anyone. And however hard the work of building a good marriage is, it's usually the better option. Obviously not always. And sometimes, unfortunately, the only option is divorce. But generally, it's the better option. So I'm saying a couple needs to prioritize the work on harmony in the home, on shalom bayis. The reality is not exactly that. The reality is often the woman is the one who initiates it and who prioritizes it. It's just part of our makeup. It's part of our spiritual makeup. Spiritually, every woman is an embodiment of God's 10th dimension, of the 10 dimensions of God's energy, the dimension called Malchus, sovereignty, which means the energy of being a recipient, of being a nurturer, which means we're far more in tune with relationships, and we far more appreciate the significance of relationships. We're just wired differently than men. And that's why we're going to focus on them, generally speaking. And we're going to step up to do the work to make them succeed, because we know we have to prioritize this. Now, when I say prioritize, that doesn't mean just on mikveh night. It means always. And maybe especially a few days before mikveh, to work on emotional intimacy, not physical, obviously, at that point, but to spend time together, to eat together, to talk together, to bond on the emotional level, so you don't feel disconnected. And now, boom, suddenly there's intimacy after I felt disconnected from my husband for the past 2 weeks. And sometimes couples do drift apart during those 2 weeks. And then suddenly it's mikvah, and a person feels distant from their husband and doesn't want to have any physical connection because they don't feel close, so they don't want to be physically close. So it's important to make sure that those 2 weeks of nida, of the time when a husband and wife cannot be physically together, should not be a distant time. On the physical level, there's separation, but it should not be separate on the emotional level. You should keep up the interaction, talking together, bonding over your shared life, bonding over your shared children. Make sure to listen and share from your day, laugh, fetch. It's then mikvah's appreciated as part of the marriage and not as something I do not want to do. And that's really, really, really important. Sometimes, of course, during that roughly 2-week time when the couple can't be together physically, it's not just that they drifted apart, they weren't together physically, and therefore they weren't together talking, and therefore they weren't together emotionally. Sometimes things happen. It happens. Life happens. Misunderstandings happen. Hurt feelings happen. That is definitely part of our existence today. But it's important if something happened, not to be like, oh my gosh, something happened, but to work on it. I remember talking to a woman or a man or a couple. It's always like, the point isn't you should have a marriage where nothing ever happens. Things are going to happen. The point is to know to work on it and how to work on it and not to let it fester. And often if things are dealt with, they could be released. And if they're not dealt with, they can grow. And of course, the more they grow, the harder it is to repair. So that is a very important thing here. Going back to knowing how important Shalom Bayis, harmony in the home, is to God. How valued, how precious. How it says that the altar cries tears by every Jewish divorce. That's not an exaggerated statement to make us feel guilty. It's talking about a reality. It's something we need to work on. It's something we need to prioritize. Now, obviously, work takes two, but someone has to initiate the work. And sometimes when one party starts sincerely, the other responds, and sometimes not. But I think the main point to emphasize now in this context is to prioritize. And unfortunately, sometimes women are overwhelmed. They're dealing with a lot. They have a list of children they need to nurture, and somewhere on the list is the husband as well. Sometimes he's the last on the list. Sometimes he seems to the woman more annoying than the rest of the list. And that makes working on Shalom Bayis and harmony in the home really hard. But in a sense, he is more important than any child, because the biggest gift you can give your children that will give them the most security, the most confidence in their lives is a home with harmony, with joy, with love. So the best is if a person can find someone to talk to who can give practical tips, how to help a person overcome whatever is making them feeling so discontent with their husband, with their marriage, with their life. And often it's sort of discontent in general and just he's an easy target. And sometimes that's what happens. A woman's home, she's dealing with children, she's overwhelmed, he's out working, he comes home, he gets to eat your delicious food, and then he lies down on the couch, and a person can feel resentful. Why does she have all the responsibilities with the family? And, and in those types of situations, it's not really about him. It's really more about the woman, about her life, about her not having the proper supports in place. And when that happens, when her life shifts, when there's a change in what's happening in her own life, in her responsibilities, in her support system, the resentment lessens and hopefully dissipates. And sometimes not. Sometimes it is with him specifically. Even so, helping resolve whatever's bothering her about her own life, which is really her issues, not anyone else's, just puts a person in a healthier perspective to then work on the other issues from a better space. But in either case, if it's my life, if it's my life plus my husband, if it's not my life at all, it's just my husband, in any of these cases, it needs to be worked on and not the night of mikvah. If mikvah night comes and the person's still upset though they did everything I said, upset and they did nothing I said, in any case, at that point, yes, as Kayla said before, there's halacha. A person has to speak to a rav. They have to speak to a rabbi who they can ask a halachic question to. What to do. We should never be our own posek. We should never be the one that determines halachic questions for ourselves. And whatever the answer is, know that's your answer. It's no one else's answer. And it's for you just this night. And the truth is there are many challenges that make marriage very challenged for many now. Affluence, pressures, virtual relationships that make us lose our skills in real relationships, media distraction. You know, your husband could be home with you all night and not there at all. So much garbage that can get in our brains so easily. For men, pornography; for women, fantasizing, social media, just a much more exciting, not real life, which creates a lot of dissatisfaction with her current reality. So all of that is really addressing a woman who is saying, I'm not going to mikvah because I don't want to be with my husband. And that's one issue. There's another issue in this situation, looking at these situations, which is a much greater tragedy. And a much greater tragedy is women who stop going to mikvah for totally different reasons. Not because they're upset at their husbands and don't want to be with them, but for women who can't be bothered, who don't like it, who maybe aren't too careful in the commandments, not so meticulous in how they serve God, and they just slack off. Maybe a number of women started slacking off during COVID. They were scared, and then they just continued after. Maybe they stopped 1 month, and then their husband didn't say anything, so they continued not going. And maybe they never knew that mikvah is vital for their marriage and is vital for their children. And it's a real tragedy. It's a tragedy because any child conceived without mikvah is not well. On some level, there's a problem. The good news is that if a woman goes to mikvah after, retroactively, the child will heal. But any child conceived without mikvah, until that happens, is not well. It's a tragedy because all intimacy is a forbidden act forever until mikvah. Even if in the interim she becomes pregnant, even if she's after menopause, it doesn't make a difference. Every relationship is forbidden, which creates literally an evil breathing in that marriage with each physical contact. And it's a tragedy because mikvah is the spiritual tool to bring many, many blessings to the family. And most significantly, in our context, the blessing of shalom bayis, of peace, of harmony in the home. And unfortunately, I know more than one case where a woman stopped going to mikvah just because she couldn't be bothered. And mysteriously, the marriage so deteriorated that it ended in divorce. And there were no problems with the couple that led to her not going to mikvah. She just couldn't be bothered. But after that stopping of mikvah, somehow things developed in the relationship and deteriorated, and the marriage fell apart. I don't think this is relevant to anyone here, but I think it's very relevant to know this information, because who knows who you're supposed to be God's emissary for in this situation. If you know anyone in this situation, and it could be you know them, you just don't realize that's what's going on. And it could be you do realize. If you know, it's incredibly important to talk to them about the significance of mikvah. This is the cornerstone of the Jewish marriage, of Jewish family. It's not trivial. There are so many accounts recorded of women sacrificing to go to mikvah in communist Russia during the destruction of the temple and its aftermath, Holocaust. There are incidents of couples not touching for years because of no mikvah. There's so many stories I know I wasn't sure which story to say, and I didn't want to blow you over with too many. I'm just going to share one little point that maybe you know already. It has to do with Moshe Feinstein. Now, Moshe Feinstein, before he came to America, was a rav, a rabbi, in a town in Russia. This is after the communists had already taken over. And of course, the communists shut down everything and all of religion deteriorated. So in Reb Moshe's town, there wasn't the ritual bath, the building structure that was built for the mikvah was no longer usable. It just wasn't kosher anymore. And there was like a river nearby. There was some pool of water. There was a way to go to mikvah, which was a lot harder. It was Russia. It's cold. It's icy in the winter. It wasn't comfortable. It didn't feel very safe, but there was a way to do it. And that was sort of what the people in the town had to do. This is the very beginning when communists took over. So obviously there were still a lot of religious families in the town, but a lot of women were not going to do that. And therefore they just didn't go to mikvah, which meant they couldn't have relationships. And finally, it got so hard for them that the town butcher came to Reb Moshe And he said, like, that's it. If you don't find a way to make that mikvah permissible, I'm just going to, I mean, I wasn't there. I've heard different versions of the story. I don't know if he threatened to just have relationships with a non-Jewish woman. I think that's generally what I've heard he said. Like, that's it. I'm done. I can't go on like this. I can't touch my wife. I just, you've got to make that mikvah kosher. I'm just going to find another woman. Everybody should realize that he really had to do it, because that is what this person and probably many other people would start doing. One way or another, something was going to happen that would not be very kosher. So he did whatever he could to the mikvah, and he matired it. He said, okay, you can use it. Now here Rabbi Moshe is in a very big dilemma, because it wasn't really very kosher. It was very, very, very borderline kosher. Definitely not something his wife would go to, which was fine. I mean, his wife wasn't going to it before for all, this whole time she was going to the river. But he realized he had a problem, because if his wife continued going to the river, nobody in town would know that. But they'd see, she has children, she gets pregnant. I mean, obviously there's a family life happening, which means the assumption would be she's using that mikvah that Rav Moshe knew was only barely by a hair's breadth, could you call it kosher? And he and his wife decided that from now on, they were just not going to use mikvah until they were able to get out of Russia. And that's why Rav Moshe has, I think he had one or two children from before. And then for a number of years, he had no children. And then when he came to America, he had another child. His son, Reb Ruvain, was born in America after his mother could again use mikvah. An incredible, incredible story. Not something on our level, not something we're being asked to do, but just an incredible, very nuanced story of just understanding what it means, mikvah, and the significance of it, and of course the responsibility for it to really be a kosher mikvah. So I sometimes tell people, listen, if you want to be chilled in your relationship with God, don't cut corners here. Pick another area. That's okay. I mean, I don't know if I can say it's okay. I don't think any of it's okay. Pick Shabbos. Pick how modest your clothing is. Don't pick mikvah. It's not worth it. It's not fair to your kids. Imagine a divorce because a woman couldn't be bothered keeping these laws. So why are we talking about this? For you to know this. And hopefully for you to know this and never know a woman in that situation. But if you do, for you to find a way to share this information and really emphasize how important it is. There's a third situation I'm aware of. So we discussed a woman who isn't going because she doesn't feel very connected to her husband. We discussed women who don't go because they can't be bothered. And there's a third situation I'm aware of. When a woman is religious, goes to mikvah, does not push it off. She knows that's not appropriate and she's not allowed to do that. And you have to go to mikvah and you can't push it off. And then doesn't want her husband to touch her because there's friction between the two of them. Now, that sounds better than the first situation. And obviously it's much, much better than the second. But it's actually a problem. If a person goes to mikvah and doesn't have relations, according to the Arizal, she is a target for klipa. Because through the mitzvah of mikvah, she becomes saturated with a special kedusha, a special holiness, specifically designed for intimacy, for the couple being together that night. And if they're not together, there's the possibility of that evil attacking her to absorb that energy. That energy is very enticing for evil. And that's the reason, if you've ever been in a situation, you might know this law, is the reason for the injunction that if a woman goes to mikvah and is not with her husband that night, she needs to sleep with a knife under her pillow. Because somehow that knife, following the injunction of the sages, that knife is protecting her. So she shouldn't be harmed mentally, emotionally, by the attack of that evil. Like the idea of someone being possessed, but in a milder form. This solution of the sages, the knife under the pillow, is not a long-term solution. It's a technical solution. In a case where, like, when would you use this? You're supposed to go to mikveh, you're supposed to have relationships. What are they talking about knives under pillows for? But sometimes technically there's a situation that comes up. Like, for example, my husband's out of town. Maybe he's coming back tonight. Maybe not. It's my mikveh night. What do I do? So we're told, go to mikveh. It's your mikveh night. And if he comes home, it's your mikveh night. And if he doesn't come, sleep with a knife. So that was just in that situation where you didn't know yes or no, and therefore you did the right thing and you went and he didn't come. So that's what happened. That's life. And that happens sometimes, and sleep with a knife. Or another situation that sometimes could come up is, let's say you are not home and you're in a different city where there's a much better mikveh than in your own town. And it's your mikveh night. And your husband's not here. Your husband's home. You're not home. So what should you do? It's your mikveh night. You could go to mikveh. Your husband's not in town. He's in one town. You're in a different town. But this is a much better mikveh. So we're told, go to mikveh. And if you and your husband aren't going to be together that night because you're in two separate towns, sleep with a knife till tomorrow night when you'll be together. Or sometimes it can happen. A person's husband's sick. He's weak. He doesn't know if physically he would have the strength to have relationships. So what should you do? We're told, go to mikveh. And if he's too weak, sleep with a knife. That's the concept. The concept is not, I'm angry at my husband, but I'm a religious person, so I go to mikveh, and then I sleep with a knife until I get over it. Of course, at the same time, as we said, we're not supposed to have relationships when we're angry, when we're contemplating divorce. So if a person's in that situation, again, you have to ask a Rav, what should you do? And whatever the Rav's answer is, no, it's only your answer. Possibly it's only for this time. It's a very, very nuanced situation. And again, the real solution, of course, is that the marriage needs to heal. But you can't come home from mikveh and then heal your marriage. It's something to focus on. Understanding that if you're in a space that you're religious, and you go to mikveh, and you don't want him to touch you, there's a problem that needs to be addressed. A core issue in the marriage, and you don't want it to fester, you want to address it. Now, obviously, if a person's been married for 10 years or 15 years or 20 years or 25 years, it's very normal and healthy and fine if they're not lusting for each other. That's normal, depending on their age, depending on their stress level, depending on their exhaustion level. But it should still be nice. It should be enjoyable. It should be positive. And if a person is feeling, ooh, I don't want that to happen, don't touch me, then something needs to heal. And God willing, with all the good that we're doing to bring down God's blessings, and with all the work that we do on creating harmony in our home, God willing, it will heal, and it will be a positive experience to be together.